There's no need for an introduction. I'm just going to go ahead and start out by disconnecting the battery. Remember, I always disconnect the negative terminal first. That way you don't accidentally arc against something whenever you're taking off the positive cable. I'm going to start with just pulling all the plug wires off and getting them out of the way. To kind of save time in the future, it'd be best to align the engine on top dead center, pointed at number 1, and then whenever you go to put it back together, you already know where it's going to be. Okay, so right here I'm just going to unplug the distributor, take off the hot wire. I have an extra, that was the tach. I also have an extra ground because I have aftermarket ignition control module, but just go ahead and take everything off of the distributor and then pull the cap. So take all the vacuum lines off. Right here I'm using a screwdriver to take these clips loose. They're actually fill-ups and I'm using a flathead, and that's why I'm having a little bit of trouble, but either way they came off. Okay, so now they have all 4 screws loose, I can pull the cap off. When this is wired up, this is number 1. I'm marking on the distributor cap right here. It's also where it points at number 1. So you just got to line this up back to where it was at and make sure the timing mark is on top dead center, and then you could take it apart and you'd be able to put it back together just how it was. I'm having trouble aligning it, so I'm just going to go ahead and pull all the plugs out. The reason I pulled the plugs is because that will make the engine easier to spin. That way I can align the timing mark on the front balance to the timing tab. Alright, so now that I have the plugs pulled out, the next step is to align the timing mark on the front harmonic balance. Make sure it's on top dead center before I take the rest of it apart. Right here I'm using a ratchet, and I'm spinning the engine with the bolt that goes in the front of the crank, which I really don't recommend doing this. That's part of the reason why I pulled the plugs, because you can break this bolt off and that would be a disaster. They do make special tools that bolt on the harmonic balance, and I suggest using one of those. And it should look a little something like this. It's probably hard to tell, but that line, that's the timing mark, and that's the 0 mark. Just make sure they're aligned right there. Alright, and this is where number 1 is supposed to be. Next to where the battery hooks up, not the first one, the second one. And then you go, the rotor is pointing right there at it. It's also pointing towards number 1 cylinder. Might as well take this off. So the next part that's going to save time in the future is you have to figure out a way to get the water out of the manifold and out of the block, so that way when you take it off it doesn't dump a whole bunch of water in your oil. If you do dump it in there, if you do get some in there, you're just going to have to drain the oil and replace it, I guess. Alright, so now I'm going to drain the radiator. Mine has this little drain valve at the bottom, but if you don't have one of these, you're just going to have to pull the lower radiator hose or something and try not to make a mess. Alright, so how do we get all the water out? I would do it like this. I think this is the smartest idea. Take this hose off. This is just temporary. I'm going to end up plugging the intake and the heater. That's for your heater hoses. Since I don't have a heater box in there, I can't run a heat. I have to just plug these. And I just destroyed the clamp toward the hose. Still didn't get it off. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and just take off the upper radiator hose and let that water come out. Alright, so whenever you have the radiator cap off and you have your drain plug open into a good container, it's a good idea to go ahead and blow some air into this hose. I actually blow air into this for about maybe 3 or 4 minutes. And now we can move on to taking the distributor out. It's a 9/16 bolt. Just take this clip loose or the little hold down, and after you have that loose you can slide it back, and then you can pull the distributor. It's not the cap, that's the distributor base, I guess you would call it. Anyway, you can just pull it out and put it in a safe place. And now I'm going to go ahead and pull the carburetor fuel line loose and eventually pull the carburetor off because it's actually getting in the way of me taking off some of the manifold bolts. Hopefully I don't dump any water in here, but now you can take the intake bolts off. You just have 6 bolts. It's pretty obvious where they're at. They're right there. 2 here, 2 here, and 2 there. And on the other side, the same thing. I was going to pull it with the carb in place, but it's kind of in my way. Okay, so with the carb out of the way, now I can get to these bolts in the middle of the intake. Sometimes the valve cover's pinching a little bit on the edges. I think the valve covers are pinching it at the edge. Just in case, I'm going to take these out. And loosen the bottom ones so that way you could pick it up a little bit without bending. And do the same thing to the other side, of course. I'm just taking the top completely out, loosening the bottom just enough to give it some room so the valve cover can lift up without bending it. Look at that, not even a drop of water went down in the oil. Not even a drop. And now it's already on top dead center on number 1, ready to just assemble it, to put the new one on it. This engine's real clean on the inside. The gasket came off pretty good where I won't have that much trouble cleaning it. It kind of just peeled off and mainly stuck to the intake side, which is awesome. There's some sand there, but not too much. So I'm just going to try to wipe it without dropping it. Okay, so after trying to wipe all the sand off without dropping any in the intake, I'm going to go ahead and blow it all off real good with the air compressor. And the 2 mating surfaces for the intake look really clean. I really don't have that much work to do at all, and that's always a plus because there's nothing worse than having to scrape gasket material off of an intake or off of the heads, especially because you're going to just drop it right into the oil area or whatever. So yeah, that's a good thing. If you found this video useful, don't forget to like and subscribe.